Me kore e taea e te whenu kotahi ki te raranga i te whariki ke mohio hei tātou kia tātou. Mā te mahi tahi o ngā whenu, mā te mahi tahi o ngā kairaranga ka oti tenei whariki i te otinga me titiro tātou ki ngā pai ka puta mai. A tana wā hoki titiro ki aua raranga i makere. Nā te mea he korero anō kei reira.
I've done a lot of contemplation about who Motoitoi is, was, and remains today. That began a journey for me of discovery, trying to piece together the jigsaw puzzle of who she was and where she came from. Yeah, so that's where it all began, really.
I was always told I was descended from a Māori princess. Well, what does that mean, a Māori princess? And when you say that to your friends as a kid, you know, oh, I'm descended from a Māori princess, they kind of laugh at you. You know, what is that?
Motoitoi is my ancestor. She's the woman that I most strongly identify with in terms of my Māori whakapapa. She's somebody that I've heard about my whole life. But when I think of my ngaitahutanga, I definitely think of Motoitoi.
In 2014, a few of us had the idea that it would be good to have a reunion just for Motoitoi and the descendants of her 3 girls.
What I really liked about it was meeting all these other people who all felt the same strong connection to Motoitoi.
And there was a very firm resolve at the end of that weekend that we were connected, we were part of the same family.
The amount of people coming from Australia, Canada, and North Island, South Island, all over, all drawn to that place. Because it's intrinsic in anybody, knowing who you are and where you've come from. For me, Purakanui, it's a special place. For a long time as a child, there were a lot of ghosts there for me. I knew there were a lot of bones of my ancestors in that place, and I could feel them, and it was frightening. And I kept hearing half stories about tapu, rahui, all these massacres, all this trouble and anguish, and don't go there and don't do this and you can't have that. I've always felt those spirits and always felt those voices, but I never understood who they were. When I come back to Purakanui now from being away, there's noise in your life, everyday life. Walking into the urupa, I had to put that noise aside and hear those spirits again, because they're all there, all of them.
The Maori land and whakapapa genealogy go hand in hand. You can't have land without a whakapapa, and you can't have a whakapapa without the whenua, which is the land, and the whenua is also the umbilical cord back to mum, to her mum, to her mum. And I could sit here all day and all night for 1,000 years to her mum. Whenua ki te whenua. There's a spiritual connection there. It's Mother Earth's whenua, as well as this.
We are the Kai Tahu. We are the guardians of the environment. That's what Kai Tahu tanga is. Everybody owns the land, but not the way perhaps Pākehā look at it. If they own the land, they would have a padlock on the door. You come in when we let you in. That's just a different mental attitude to ownership of land.
The amount of land that Māori have is really small. You know, in terms of the size of New Zealand, the amount of land that is in our ownership is minuscule. We're lucky at Purakanui because we do have our Māori land there. When we were children, we'd often stay at Purakanui, and a standari would take us walking around the beaches and, you know, saying this is where Motoitoi had lived. And so I always had a sense of Purakanui being her place.
There was an enactment by the Government of New Zealand in 1967, the Maori Affairs Amendment Act. But it was ill thought out, and it had some quite obnoxious clauses in it.
The laws didn't tend to recognise the possibly spiritual or cultural associations with those lands. The land ceased to have Māori freehold land status and was deemed general or European land, so personal property, just like your general property, money in your bank account and so forth.
And I realised that if this was going to go on, then the continuity of the land would be lost, and the ability to manage the land would also be lost. And so I started a process of applying to the Maori Land Court to have the land incorporated instead of having a title to a piece of the land. The owners had shares to equivalent amount in the land.
The land ownership is, again, a legal entity. There's multiple owners and there's paper with lines drawn on it. But what it is for us, those of us that have come of that place, it's the spiritual belonging to a spot that our ancestors walked on. And there's not much of it left. There's a very small postage stamp left. It's not even enough to sustain us. But that doesn't take away our connection to that place.
Purako Nui and Whariakiaki have had people living at them for the last 800 to 900 years. Initially, the Maori people came to harvest the resources of the adjoining ocean, and then in the 1820s and 1830s, the sealers and the whalers from many nationalities came to similarly harvest those same resources.
Motoitoi was a Kai Tahu woman who lived at the Otago Heads in 1838. Got together with Richard Driver and had 3 daughters. The story of Richard Driver and Motoitoi was told to me as a child in a very romantic fashion, in that Driver landed at Whariakiaki from a ship. They were looking for water. The story told to us was that there was an attack. Maori people killed a number of the men from the ship. 2 escaped, Driver was one.
And apparently, Driver was being pursued, and Motoitoi decided to put her cloak around him so that the Māori couldn't touch him, because if they were to touch him, they would be abusing her right. And that's what saved him.
Within that, there is a lot of some mythological stories that have grown up that Richard Driver's life was saved by Motoitoi throwing her cloak over him when he was about to be killed by the savage Māori. But in actual fact, that era was a previous era when there was conflict between Māori and the newcomers, the Pākehā coming to the coast. Anyway, Richard Driver, he was a great storyteller, and he would meet people on the boats after guiding them into the harbour and tell all sorts of lurid stories about how savage the Māori were once and so on and so forth. And one of the stories he told was about being saved by Motoitoi and then marrying her as the chief's daughter. We know from the stories I've heard that Motoitoi and Richard Driver lived in a cave near Whariakiaki. That for a period of time, Motoitoi lived there and Richard was her servant. And it wasn't some cold, dank place. It was a luxurious place and befitting her status in the community. Unfortunately, history sort of paints another picture of people who live in caves. But that's okay. We forgive them.
The other piece of the story which seems to change and shift around a little bit is just where was this cave? And we've always been shown a place in Whariaki itself, just tucked in under the road, and it was quite a dry, warm place. But then when you have a good look around Kaikai's beach, which is the next beach in between Whariaki and Aramoana, it could also be there, because we know that driver was able to watch out for boats coming in from his cave, or whether they lived in both places, I don't know. But the truth of it all isn't as quite as simple and straightforward as we were told as children.
Whariaki is a very important site for Māori and for Māori Pākehā history. Its Māori name is Whariaki. That's the old Māori name. It became Murderer's Beach. It's known by most people as Murderers. And that name comes from an incident there in 1817. Basically, 3 sealers were killed on a sealing boat that came ashore. But in actual fact, the boat was bringing back a man called Taka to this place, and he had lived there for a number of years earlier. So he thought he was returning to people he knew. But something had happened there. Something had changed. So while he was away, there had been all these little incidents along the coast. There was a whole series of small skirmishes, but nevertheless quite bloody. And it seems that most of them had taken place because of misunderstandings in some instances, where sealers had come to this coast and thought it was empty, basically apart from a few Māori, and just carried on exploiting resources regardless. And sometimes I think it was just pure arrogance on the part of the Pākehā sealers, who thought the Māoris were just savages and could be treated any way, which way they pleased.
The name Murdering Beach was another classic example of the insensitivity of people from one culture against those from another. And so I applied to the Geographic Board for a name change from Murdering Beach to Whariaki, from Long Beach to Wharawirira, and I also asked that the original name for Pūrākau Nui be restored by the insertion of an additional U in the name.
There was resistance from some community groups. Locally, was a little bit harder to try and implement that change.
If those names weren't corrected, then over a period of time, they would be lost, because people would not remember where those locations exactly were.
The story of why Pūrākau Nui is called that. And my understanding is back in the 1700s, there was one hell of a dust-up at Motoitoi Pā. And about 250 people were killed. Only a few survived by jumping into the water from the cliffs. Those that were killed were piled up, and it snowed overnight, and the next morning the arms and legs that were sort of sticking out looked like a pile of sticks, and that's what Pūrākau Nui means. So by taking that U out of the rākau bit, because rākau means stick, it lost that meaning, and that was the reason it was given that name. So it was important to reflect the correct meaning of the name of Pūrākau Nui.
Great to be back here with Pūrākau Nui School, and we're going to go on another field visit to an archaeological site, an old place where people used to live, where not many people live now. Yes?
How old's the beach?
In terms of how long people have lived there, about 1,000 years.
Heaps of people have found pounamu here.
Yes, and that's why the bay is so special, because lots of heitiki and pounamu adzes and other ornaments have been found there, more so than at many of our other sites, where we do find similar things, but just not in such a great quantity. Good question.
How popular was pounamu?
Well, very popular. So once the first Europeans showed up in their sailing ships and they interacted with Māori, who were supplying them with potatoes and flax and other things, a trade developed which brought an income to Māori that had never been available before, and also provide iron and blankets and various things that were thought to be good for Māori, although the blankets sometimes contained disease and that was very bad for them, but they didn't know that at the time. So many questions.
How much greenstone has been found over the years on that beach?
More than 300 pounds.
What if we found some?
Well, it's unlikely where we will be, I'm guessing, because we won't be walking over the site. But if you did, normally you'd report it to the museum, and the museum would process it as a artefact or a taonga belonging to the nation, and it would be processed by Heritage New Zealand. After so much waiting, at last we're here at Whare. So I'll just start off by acknowledging some of the people who've lived here earlier, their tribes. So I acknowledge Waitaha people, Rapuwai, Hawea, Ngāti Māmoe and Kai Tahu. And those are the people we've come here to study. So I acknowledge them and say to their spirits, we come in good faith and to learn. So you can just imagine the wakas, the canoes pulled up on the beach. You can almost see it now. And the pa site, the village, was out here on this flat on the other side of the creek. So we've got the old settlement back there in the old sand dunes and the more recent settlement out here on the flat. And so this is where the pounamu was found, out on this flat.
How did they get the food?
Well, the people who were excavating those sites, digging them out and finding the pounamu under that sand out there, were finding fish hooks, very similar to the ones we have today for catching the fish. They're finding bird spears, eel spears. We find clubs that would have been used for whacking seals on the head to kill them and eat them. Through archaeology, through digging the ground, that's how we've learned about those people, even though we don't know much about them.
The diseases that came with, first of all, the sealers and then the whalers, and they were the unwelcome strangers. The population probably shrunk by at least a half. It's very hard to get good figures. However, most authorities that have looked at this question say at least the population was halved by over a space of maybe a decade or 2 decades too. So we're not talking about a long period of time. And this was a particularly catastrophic thing for southern Māori. And it is probably as a result of some of those introduced diseases that Motoitoi died.
I was quite surprised when I found out that she was only actually in her 20s when she passed away, because she seemed like such a major figure. I just assumed she'd lived until she was an older person.
She died. Different versions have been given of sickness, but the story has changed over the years as people have spoken more freely about things that it was believed that quite possibly driver was ill-treating her and hitting her. And I have heard a story that she died of a brain hemorrhage. I don't know the truth of what happened to Motoitoi. But for Betty, my mother, her curiosity about her history and connections showed itself in her artwork. Motoitoi's hands are up. And as I sit and look at that, I see a double meaning. The early fairy story of Motoitoi was her hands were up begging for driver, save this man, to her father. And then the other overlay of meaning is were her hands raised to protect herself? The different meanings which over the years have come into these stories. When Motoitoi died, driver was not able to look after those 3 small children, and they were separated. Mariah stayed with him. Emma went south down to Bluff. Mary went up into the Canterbury area.
And it's very common within our families for, particularly at that period where our people were suffering from plague, sickness and poverty, for our families and the children and families to be raised by other families.
But then Richard married Elizabeth Robertson, which is an early Otago family from Scotland, and had 17 children, I think, who are drivers, but they're not from Motoitoi.
The relationship for those in Purakaunui between Driver and Robertson's descendants and Driver and Motoitoi's descendants was perhaps at a distance.
In the 2000 family reunion, I foolishly offered to be on the organising committee, and I represented the Motoitoi side of the family. And I experienced some very great frustrations. And I certainly did feel, as I had felt as a child, the sense, again, of something second rate. You had a feeling of some stigma. Another strong feeling of the tension between the two families. My cousin talks about the white side and the brown side of the family, because that was the language of the 50s and 60s, would not walk within a whip's length of each other. And she talked about Nana walking up the hill with her and saying, come on, we have to hurry, we're on driver land. So there was just a sense of some injustice or some ill treatment or some bad feeling, really, really strong, and not openly talked about, but I always had a sense of it.
I didn't live primarily in Purakanui as a child, but I'd spent all my school holidays there. And that was something my mum went to great pains to ensure that happened. Was that we went to Purakanui every Easter break, every long weekend, every Christmas holidays. But in doing so, have maintained a connection with the place and got to know the characters that have lived there permanently, and have certainly been raised with all the stories, and historical stories, and some of them family fables, and all of them part of the place.
The Māori of Purakanui, there were many who had connections to other places. Those who tried to stay there did try and establish a kaika of some importance. I mean, that is clear. But the thing that was against them was the poorness of that reserve. This was a consequence of the land purchases, which had been designed from the Pākehā point of view to try and limit Māori ownership of land so that Māori were not landlords, so that Māori would have to work for them. And that way they saw, of course, they saw that as a way of civilising Māori. But Māori themselves, they were basically swindled out of an ability to prosper in that world, except at the lowest levels.
Our parents had about 20 milking cows, and they separated the milk and obtained cream and sent that by rail to a factory in Dunedin. But a large amount of our sustenance came still from living off the land. Lots of rabbits which had been caught, and my mother used to cook them and pot roast them, and I can still fondly remember those, and fish from the ocean and that sort of thing. It was a time when there were no social benefits payable, so they really had to survive on what they could obtain from that land.
Amihi ki te whenua, te moana, te herenga, o ngā rātou nehera. Apparently I was only 3 weeks old, and this very old lady from Waitangi, she came to the pā, and she asked if she could have me. And the rātana, he advised my parents to let me go. And then that meant that I was taken up to the Tiriti, the eastern seaboard of the North Island. So it wasn't until I went to school, and a teacher, Pākehā lady, she said, "What's your home life like?" I said, "Oh, it's earth floor, tin roof, no power." She said, "Gee, you must be poor." I thought, poor? I always had a full tummy, and I had all the love that I needed. So I was rather bemused, perhaps, at her expression of being poor.
When I talk about this history, I use the words whakatuatuku me whakatomo. So one word means letting go, and the other means holding on. So Māori families in particular, they held on to as much as they could and let go the rest to make a living. There were a lot of other things in this world of the 19th and early 20th century in which were prejudicial to Māori, for instance, retaining their own language, to retaining many elements of their own culture, but some things they held on to.
Well, very little language survived. It was a time, possibly throughout most of New Zealand, when Māori as a race was considered to be in decline and on the way out. And with only 3 or 4 of part Māori descent in Pūrākau, there wasn't much opportunity to practice Māori language.
The pressures on our family at that time, being the end of the 19th century, it was very clear that they were in a world of being completely assimilated into European culture. And it's quite an incongruous thing to see these dark-featured, beautiful girls dressed as Victorian women. But that was their world. They married into the Pākehā world, the European world, and lived that way of life.
And for southern Māori, that was easier to do than, say, in the North Island, particularly in the southern part of the South Island, because those Pākehā intermarriages had taken place so much earlier that people were starting to become very fair in appearance, not so Polynesian in appearance. And so it was very easy for them to let go those things in the Māori world that, say, their parents and their grandparents had held on to and just become a part of the Pākehā world.
When I go to the marae, everybody has, white skin. Well, not everybody, but, a huge number, and it's just the way Māori are here. We've had intermarriage. I think Motoitoi is a good example of that. We've had intermarriage really early on from whalers, from sealers. And so that's a strong and accepted part of Ngāi Tahu history.
So the challenges to be fair-skinned Māori are that it's almost like you have a disguise. And you can choose whether or not to declare who you are. And there are situations I've encountered of the most extreme racism and rudeness where I don't tell people who I am, but I promise myself not to go back there.
It was difficult for me to find the connection to Māoridom here at home initially. There's no uniquely Dunedin Māori presence within the popular culture in Dunedin at all that I can see. I know that's changing.
If you're asking someone that's not Māori, may have lived in Dunedin all of their life or for a number of generations, they're probably going to think our Scottish history, our Victorian architecture. If you were to then say to those same people, well, what's your understanding of Dunedin's Māori heritage? They might go, down at the heads there's a marae, and there were some Maoris out at Karatani as well. They possibly, it's hard to answer, but they possibly wouldn't acknowledge Pūrākau. It sometimes gets left out.
Growing up in Musgiel, there's not a lot of Māori faces. Culturally, I'm New Zealander, but I'm also Kai Tahu. I'm very clear about that. That's something it's been a long journey. It's taken a long time to come to it, and I'm still coming to it. But that Kai Tahu culture is irrespective of colour. The decision to start on the journey to take on tāmoko didn't come right away. It was a debate, an internal debate, because at first I didn't feel I was entitled. White skin, not immersed in the culture. I don't have te reo. So, how dare you think that you can even have tāmoko? And so slowly I formed a relationship with a moko artist in the North Island. But he led me to the concept of being okay in the modern sense to express who you are. That was the first revelation. I remember him saying, laughing and saying, look, Māoris these days drive around in Toyota Corollas and they have Apple Watches and they talk on iPhones, but they're modern people. He said, stop trying to measure yourself against some ideal that's 150 years old. Measure yourself against your own ideals here and now.
It's so good when people acknowledge their Maori background. I don't just mean in Te Waitangi, but throughout New Zealand, even if they're basically more European by marriage. Times have changed. There was a time when you concealed that. That's no longer the case. It's pride, and it's healthy for New Zealand that this attitude throughout be acknowledged.
And I see the change from when I was a young person at school, where we were very protective and closed of our Māori-ness. And there was some real pain around it. And to be at a primary school and an intermediate school, to be teased about your ethnicity and belittled about it, to know that today being Māori is really cool for kids and youth.
I think the thing that I've really learnt as an adult is that we need the culture to be evolving and to be modern and to be relevant. And I think that's something that we are doing really well.
The sense of Kai Tahu culture and the Māori spirituality, or the holistic approach to looking at things, has given me a confidence. It's given me a sense of belonging, a calmness, I guess. Also, it's not to say that you feel like you're special, but I can be placed on the face of the planet.
I hope the future generations can be very proud of who they are, and in that way to stand very tall and proud of being Māori, of being connected to Pūrakonui. And the layers of history it's not always been easy. There's been a lot of tragedy, sad stories of loss and grief, but the beauty and the inspiration of that natural world, of the environment, it's the most incredible landscape, and it's a place to call home.
We are born into this country with nothing. And when you die, you take out nothing. But while you are here, it is everybody's responsibility to care for the land the best way they can, to leave it in a better condition for the generations yet to come. And that's the difference of Māori thinking.
I dreamed of a journey, itaku mohemoia. The road was a river of mist, he ararere kohu. The rocks were encrusted with crystal, kakorakora mahi katoka. Twisted trees rising from wood, Ka te puwhakawhiri ka rakau. It wound above a harbour. Ka kopi mahi te whanga. It wound above the sea. Ka kopi mahi te moana. I suddenly knew with a burst of joy. Ka tahi te kakau hari. Where the road was leading me. Ke te marama tenei wharahi. Home to Aramoana. Ki te kaika o Aramoana. Home to Pura Kaunui. Ki te kaika